Why did German Captain Otto Hullman believe every single American soldier was a commander? December 20th, 1944. A frozen clearing in the Ardennes forest. A German captain named Otto Hullman crouches behind a snowdrift with field glasses pressed to his eyes, watching something he cannot explain. 200 meters across the clearing, 12 American soldiers are positioned behind a railway embankment. He has counted them. He knows their commanding officer is no longer with them. He watched the leader fall 30 minutes prior during the initial engagement. By every rule of engagement Hullman was taught at the infantry school in Döberitz, those 12 Americans should now be doing one of three things. They should be retreating, they should be surrendering, or they should be huddled exactly where they are, waiting for a new leader to be sent forward from the rear. Instead, they are doing something his binoculars cannot quite register. They are moving. 2 of them have crawled into a drainage ditch and disappeared. 3 others have shifted left where the embankment dips and are now directing their attention toward the woods on his right flank. A sergeant, Hullman can see the stripes on the man's sleeve through the snow flurries, has crawled back the other direction and is gesturing to a rifleman with a Browning automatic rifle who is taking up a new position 20 meters away. Nobody is shouting. Nobody is using a radio. The commander is gone. And yet, in front of the captain's eyes, the squad is reorganizing itself on its own into a strategic maneuver aimed precisely at the German position that just halted their advance. Hullman lowers the field glasses. He turns to his runner, a 19-year-old named Karl, and says something that German officers in 3 other clearings, in 3 other engagements that same brutal week, are saying almost word for word. He says in German, "Verdammt, who is commanding these men?" Karl does not have an answer. Neither does the captain. Neither, by January of 1945, will any of the senior German generals gathered in secret at a converted English country house north of London, where British intelligence officers are recording every word the prisoners say without their knowledge. Because the question that captain whispered in the snow that morning is the question this entire investigation turns on. The Wehrmacht was the army that popularized the modern concept of decentralized command. The doctrine had a name: Auftragstaktik, or mission tactics. Tell a subordinate what to accomplish, never tell him how, and trust him to figure out the rest. The Germans had been training their officers in this idea for more than a century. They had built a highly flexible command system. They had used it to advance rapidly across Europe in the early years of the conflict. And by the autumn of 1944, when their own captains were looking across snowfields and hedgerows at American squads operating without visible orders, they could not understand what they were watching. This was not because the Americans had done something the Germans did not know how to do, but because the Americans had done something the Germans had quietly stopped being able to do, and had, in some essential way, perhaps never done at quite that level before. To understand why a German captain in the Ardennes was calling out into the snow, asking who was in charge of those Americans, we need to go back. We need to go back to a Prussian general staff officer in 1806, and to a single, catastrophic afternoon outside a small German town called Jena. On October 14, 1806, Napoleon Bonaparte defeated the Prussian army at the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt. It was a complete breakdown. The army of Frederick the Great, the most drilled parade ground machine in Europe, met an enemy that refused to fight by the traditional rules and was shattered in a single afternoon. The Prussian officer corps, sifting through the aftermath, made a consequential observation. They had been trained to wait for orders. Napoleon's officers, by contrast, had been trained to think. When the situation changed in front of a Prussian colonel, the colonel froze. When the situation changed in front of a French marshal, that marshal acted. The Prussians made a decision. They were going to adapt their system based on what had just defeated them. The men at the center of that effort were Gerhard von Scharnhorst and his protege, Karl von Clausewitz. Together, they began to rebuild the Prussian army around a different principle.
Strategic movements involve uncertainty. The original plan rarely survives initial contact with the opposition. The commander at the highest level cannot possibly know what is happening at the lowest level fast enough to react. So you do not try. You give the person at the lowest level a clear understanding of why they are there and what their commander wants accomplished, and you let them figure out how to do it. It took decades and several conflicts to refine, but by the time Helmut von Moltke the Elder took command of the Prussian army in the late 19th century, the system had a defined doctrine. Moltke wrote that an order that can be misunderstood will be misunderstood. Therefore, do not give detailed orders. Give intent. Give purpose. Give the result you want. Then get out of the way of the person who has to make it happen. There is a story every German cadet learned that captures this philosophy. Prince Frederick Charles of Prussia was reprimanding a major for committing a tactical error during a maneuver. The major protested that he was only following orders. The prince replied, "His Majesty made you a major because he believed you would know when not to obey his orders." That was the heart of the German military tradition that would enter the Second World War. It was the opposite of the rigid, unthinking soldier image that would later populate popular media. The actual doctrine said that an order that no longer fit the situation in front of you was not binding. You were expected to adjust and accomplish what the order had been intended to achieve. By 1933, this doctrine had been codified into a manual called Truppenführung, or troop leadership. It said plainly that operational environments involve friction and uncertainty. The commander on the spot must be free to decide. Initiative is the duty of every officer and every non-commissioned officer. Hesitation is a greater error than an incorrect decision actively taken. When the German army entered Poland in September 1939, the system was put to its first major test. American military analysts produced a report on that campaign, noting that the Germans had developed leadership and initiative in commanders during years of preparatory training. They wrote that commanders from the highest to the lowest echelons felt free to carry out their missions or meet changes in situations with a minimum of interference from above. The Americans wrote it down, circulated it, and then most of them filed it away and went back to standard training formations. When France fell in 1940, the system showed what it could do at its peak. Erwin Rommel, then a divisional commander, was often found far ahead of his own headquarters because he believed his place was at the front, where the situation was changing minute by minute. German junior officers were moving across northern France, making their own decisions about which roads to take, which bridges to check, and which opposing units to bypass. The French, by contrast, were operating on a command cycle that took hours to convert a frontline observation into a formal order. They were constantly reacting to yesterday's events. This was the German army that Americans first met in February 1943 in the mountains of Tunisia at Kasserine Pass. American officers had read the reports. They knew on paper what they were facing, but it did not prevent a severe setback. American forces were pushed back, losing a significant amount of equipment over several days. German commanders looked at the outcome and concluded what their analysts had been saying. They believed the Americans possessed industrial strength but lacked the experienced, adaptable qualities needed for modern operational fluidity. They referred to them as an army of material rather than adaptive strategists. Yet, 18 months after Kasserine, in the hedgerows of Normandy and the snowfields of the Ardennes, German captains would be staring through binoculars at American squads, unable to figure out who was in charge. They would not be able to predict what the squad would do next. They would not see a distinct leader because there did not appear to be one. The men would simply move as if they all knew the same thing without having been told. The first piece of the answer arrived on a beach in Normandy on the morning of June 6, 1944, when an entire American assault regiment landed in the wrong place, lost many of its leaders in the first few minutes, and adapted in a way their challengers had not anticipated. Omaha Beach, 6:30 in the morning. The first wave of A Company, 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Infantry Division. They came down the ramps of their landing craft into a defensive sector that planners had spent years designing. Within minutes of the ramps dropping, the company faced immense challenges maintaining a cohesive unit. Many of the officers and sergeants became unavailable. The remaining men were held up on the beach, seeking cover behind obstacles and a small shingle embankment. By standard calculations, with its officers gone, the unit was expected to remain disorganized. The men were expected to stay frozen until a structured operational response could be organized, or they were forced to yield. This was what many defenders had been told to expect, that without explicit leadership, the average individual would not function. That is not what happened. What actually occurred across the beach was a series of small unit improvisations. The men did not retreat or wait indefinitely. Instead, in small groups of 2, 3, or 5, with no direct orders, no overall plan, and no contact with higher headquarters, they made the same decision independently. They realized that remaining on the beach was unsustainable, that someone had to lead, and that they would have to be the ones to do it. In one account, a lieutenant named Leo van de Voort, whom the men around him did not know, stood up and urged the soldiers forward, noting that staying in place would only lead to a disadvantage. He then moved toward a key defensive position to manage it. He did not consult higher-ups or request authorization. He looked at the situation and made a decision. And the men around him followed. It happened repeatedly. Brigadier General Norman Cota, the assistant commander of the 29th Division, came ashore and began organizing groups of displaced men by sheer force of presence. Finding a group of rangers behind the seawall, he urged them to lead the way off the beach. Lieutenant Colonel Max Schneider, commander of the 5th Ranger Battalion, made a critical decision of his own. His battalion had been ordered to land at Pointe du Hoc, but the landing was delayed and the position was heavily contested. Rather than circling offshore or waiting for new instructions, he diverted his battalion to a different sector of Omaha Beach, bypassing the heaviest obstacles and safeguarding many of his men. He did not ask permission. He adapted to the reality on the ground. But the part that puzzled German officers during later discussions was what was happening at the squad level with private soldiers. Private Carlton Barrett of the 18th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, was a young man with no special rank. He landed in deep water under challenging conditions, lost his equipment, and spent the morning swimming back into the surf to help pull stranded men to safety. No one ordered him to do it. The chain of command around him was unavailable. He simply decided what the situation required and acted. In another sector, an unnamed private looked at the seawall, looked at the bluff above, and realized they had to move. He stood up, called out to the men near him, and started up the slope. Other soldiers followed. By the time they reached the top, they had formed a small, improvised team out of men from different platoons who were now following a private who had not been in a leadership role an hour earlier. These moments had one thing in common. None of them were ordered from above. They came from individual men who looked at the situation and made decisions they were not formally authorized to make. When prisoners were questioned later that summer, they frequently asked who was in command of those small units. They wanted to know the rank and position of the leaders because, despite their own doctrine of Auftragstaktik, they had built a system that empowered captains and majors but had not fully extended that same level of initiative to the average individual in the field. The Americans had not built a formal system for this. They had something else, which became visible in the hedgerows of Normandy 6 weeks later. By July 1944, the movement had shifted into the bocage country. This terrain consisted of earthen banks several feet high, topped with dense hedges and trees, breaking the landscape into tiny rectangular fields. The root systems were deep, turning every field into a natural barrier. The defenders used this terrain to turn every field into a separate position. Progress was slow and demanding. Junior officers writing reports during this period described a recurring pattern. They would establish a position only to face engagement from an unexpected flank. When they shifted to respond, they would face engagement from another direction. By the time they tried to maneuver, they often found themselves cut off by an American group that had moved through the hedgerows behind them. The reports noted that the Americans were not following a recognizable, rigid pattern. They were making decisions on the spot that could not be traced to a central written order.
To the observers, a unit operating under mission tactics was supposed to have a clear, recognizable leader directing the squad. But in the hedgerows, the leader seemed to change constantly. Sometimes it was a sergeant, sometimes a corporal, and sometimes a private who had spotted an opportunity, coordinated with a few peers, and acted without waiting for orders. This behavior stemmed from a culture the soldiers brought with them from civilian life. Consider Sergeant Curtis Cullen. Before the conflict, he had been a sales promotion assistant for a liquor distributor in New Jersey. He had no formal engineering background, but he was observant. The main challenge in the bocage was that when an American tank tried to climb over a hedgerow, its thin underbelly was exposed to defensive measures. Consequently, armor could not easily support the infantry. During a discussion in his unit, a soldier from Tennessee jokingly suggested putting teeth on the front of the tank to cut through the obstacles. While others laughed, Cullen took the idea seriously. He went to the beaches, gathered steel from salvaged defensive obstacles, cut them into prongs, and welded them to the front of a tank. He demonstrated the device to his officers, and soon Lieutenant General Omar Bradley came to see it. The modified tank successfully drove through a hedgerow instead of over it. Bradley ordered immediate production, and within days, hundreds of Rhino tanks were equipped and ready. An enlisted sergeant had developed a solution to a major operational problem using salvaged materials, and then demonstrated it directly to a general. The culture allowed him to feel entitled to solve the problem himself, rather than waiting for an engineer or an official order. The American Officer Corps in 1939 had been small and hierarchical, and their manuals were detailed and prescriptive. But the soldiers in 1944 were not relying solely on manuals. They were products of a society that valued practical problem-solving and self-reliance. They were young men who had grown up during the Great Depression, organizing local activities, repairing farm equipment, working on old car engines, and collaborating on projects without formal oversight. To them, resolving a difficult situation on their own was a normal habit. When placed in uniform, they treated the task at hand as another practical problem to be solved. They looked at the situation
and acted. The German soldier of that era, however, had been raised in a highly structured society that emphasized adherence to established authority. While they were taught initiative in their military training, their broader cultural background often suggested that taking initiative without specific authorization could be risky. As a result, a German private might wait for his sergeant, whereas an American private often did not wait. By the autumn of 1944, the German command system was facing significant challenges. The original practitioners of Auftragstaktik were being lost due to high turnover and operational demands. In 1940, German junior officers and sergeants had years of training and experience. But by mid-1944, years of intense conflict had caused high turnover among experienced leaders. Because the doctrine required leaders to guide from the front, many of the most capable officers were unavailable first. They were replaced by rapidly promoted, less experienced men who often defaulted to rigid rules because they lacked the experience to improvise. At the same time, the German high command was becoming increasingly centralized. By 1944, operational decisions were frequently managed directly from the top. Officers who showed independent judgment were sometimes dismissed, which eroded the trust necessary for decentralized command. A commander could no longer be sure that taking initiative would be supported. The safer choice was often to wait for explicit orders from above. Meanwhile, the American system was becoming more adaptable. Officers noticed that allowing their subordinates to improvise led to positive results, so they encouraged it. Trust grew naturally, and detailed orders became less necessary because the men understood the intent. This difference was clearly demonstrated in December 1944 at the Belgian town of Bastogne. When the offensive in the Ardennes began, the 101st Airborne Division was rushed to Bastogne to secure the critical road junction. The acting commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, arrived without detailed instructions. He assessed the situation, recognized the town's importance, and set up a defense. He allowed his subordinate commanders to manage their sectors, and they in turn trusted their junior officers and sergeants to handle their respective positions. When a delegation arrived under a white flag demanding surrender, McAuliffe gave his famous one-word reply, "Nuts." To the opposing officers, who expected formal, standardized, institutional responses, this was highly unusual. It was a decision made on the spot, reflecting the unconventional nature of the American defense. The defense of Bastogne held, and the offensive was delayed. Throughout the engagement, reports noted that the Americans were defending in ways that did not align with standard operational expectations, adapting to changes with unexpected speed. After the conflict, British and American intelligence examined transcripts of secret recordings made at Trent Park, the housing facility for captured senior officers. In these private conversations, the generals frequently discussed why the campaign had turned against them. They did not focus solely on material numbers or air power. They repeatedly discussed the character of the American soldier. One general noted that American personnel behaved as distinct individuals. They had their own opinions, questioned things, and yet, on the field, they performed with a strong instinct for the situation. Another commander described how a small group of American tanks, operating without an officer, had outmaneuvered his unit using moves that seemed to lack standard institutional logic, but succeeded anyway. He remarked that the Americans seemed to make decisions faster than his own men could react, describing them as having a greater degree of personal independence. A third officer concluded that while their own training emphasized precise execution of orders, the Americans had succeeded because their soldiers did not always wait to be told what to do. The German army had created an exceptional tactical doctrine in Auftragstaktik, but it required a high level of mutual trust and a specific social foundation that became difficult to sustain under pressure. The Americans, through their practical, decentralized culture, had developed a similar capability naturally. The American squad in the Ardennes was not operating in a vacuum. Its members understood the overall goal so well that they could continue the mission even when their leadership was lost. Each soldier was capable of stepping forward to fill the gap. So, to answer the question Captain Hullman asked in the snow, who is commanding these men? The answer was both no one in particular and everyone at once. The Americans had created a system where the responsibility of command was shared by every person on the line. This approach allowed them to achieve the flexibility and responsiveness that theorists had spent decades trying to define. They did not rely on a complex manual. They relied on a shared habit of taking initiative when the situation demanded it.